So what are the polls telling you right now about where in particular young men are? We've talked before about young men being such an important constituency for Donald Trump to get elected. How are they feeling 1 year in, or I guess it's 10 months into his actual rule, but it's a year since the election?
We're all familiar with those traditional questions. Do you approve? Do you disapprove? Fave, unfave, right track, wrong track. The question that I ask on a monthly basis, Joanna, in a monthly poll I do at my company, Social Sphere, is I think more direct, which is Donald Trump having a positive or negative impact on your life, okay, or no difference? And what we found in January, 10 days or so before the inauguration, we found among younger men, a majority, 55% said having a positive impact. Okay, and most of that obviously was around feeling heard and the potential for economic strength and kind of a return for younger men feeling like they could be the providers that they want to be. Okay, that was 55%.
Right, and push back against DEI and the fear of cancellation for saying what you actually think.
Exactly. All of those things. All of those things. Okay. Only 22% said negative, more than 2 to 1. Okay. The last wave of this survey that I did, it was just less than a month ago, it was end of September, and the 55% number went to 31%.
Wow, okay. That's a big drop.
Less than a third say he's having a positive impact on their life, okay? And 43% say it's negative, okay? So the way we think about this is, in January, he had a plus 33, okay? 33 points net positive impact. Mm-hmm. Today, minus 12.
Minus 12.
Okay? That's a 45-point shift, okay, in 9 months.
Is that the biggest shift you've ever seen? That seems pretty dramatic.
It's up there. I'll tell you something. Women, shifted 41 points, okay? They were net zero, okay? As many thought positive as negative. And now it's 18 positive impact, 59 negative impact.
What is the reason for that? Why are they feeling more negative than they were just before the inauguration?
I think it is just really simple, which is every time they walk out of their house or their apartment, if they're lucky to have one, okay, everything costs more than it did a year ago, right? Everything costs more than a year ago. When I looked at the overall feelings of the economy, I looked at the Economist YouGov survey over the weekend, and a majority of all Americans, the highest number in the last year, think the economy is off on the wrong track, and we can see that reflected in everybody, specifically younger people. They're 10 points more likely today than when Biden was in office a year ago to say that the economy is off on the wrong track. So much of it is driven by that one, and then also I think they're looking at the East Room. They're looking at Venezuela. They're looking at, myriad of these other issues, and they're seeing through them, and they believe it's cynical. We ask these kinds of questions in the polling, from the National Guard in Washington, D.C., through some of these other issues. They feel like they're basically an distraction from what is the reason that so many younger men voted for him in the first place. Is ultimately he promised to help them be a better provider, and many are beginning to feel betrayed.
So really, young men are impacted by the demolition of the East Wing of the White House?
I think that's just the latest in a string of what they see as distractions from President Trump doing what he promised younger people to do, right? Which is to improve the economy so they themselves could be better providers for themselves and the people that they care about. And they gave him some slack. We talked, last time we were on the pod together, we talked about the slack that younger people were giving him some time, give him, some opportunity to get his team in place to see the effect of the tariffs, et cetera. But I think that time for many young people is kind of running out for him. He needs to begin to deliver on the core promise. And when you have only 31% of younger men, 31% of younger men saying he's making their life better, I can't think of a worse number for him right now. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the 69%, okay, who think that there's been no impact or it's negative, are voting for Democrats. Okay, that's the different dynamic in this cycle compared to his first term, I think, at this point in 2017. That's a different dynamic. And Democrats cannot make the mistake that just because they disapprove, just because they think Trump is actually hurting them financially, that they're going to, end up voting in large numbers for Democrats. Outside of New York City, in a week or so from now, I don't see that happening at this moment.
Are they impacted at all, or are you getting feedback from them on the government shutdown? We're 1 month in now, and it feels like the most under-talked about government shutdown, certainly in living memory.
Yeah, I just think there's exhaustion. I was on the road doing focus groups in the earliest days of that shutdown. It was just exhaustion, and that both there wasn't like a big surprise that they blame essentially kind of both parties and the system for doing this. I don't think it's a subject. I don't think it came up over the weekend during my focus groups. It's not a subject that I'm picking up or hearing from the rank and file people that I talk to kind of at this point. If anything, it drives people to kind of the anti-establishment pathway of trying to make change. I don't think they see at this point the folks I'm talking about. I'm sure we can find a poll that shows Democrats are winning or the Republicans are winning. I don't think that matters. I think that the shutdown is doing grave damage to further damage to institutions, Congress, Washington, politics, government. That's the real damage, and it's driving people outside of the system. And that's something that I'm not sure either leader of both parties really fully appreciates.
So you're hearing negatives on Donald Trump, but you're not hearing much positive about the Democrats. If you were advising the Democrats, what would you suggest they do to counteract this?
Well, I think what you said, Joanna, was an understatement when you said you're not hearing much positive about Democrats. So one of my favorite questions to ask in focus groups was, if the parties were people, who would they be? Okay, what would they look like? Okay, if they showed up in a bar, if they showed up, in whatever.
What an interesting question. I wish I'd met you when I was at college, because I would love to have been involved in something like this.
This was a young man said this just a couple of days ago. He said, without hesitation, he said, Democrat is the HR department. It's the human resource department, okay? They act like they really care about you, but they actually work for the man. They actually work for the company, okay? Think about that, right? Who wants to be visited by the HR department? Okay, it's never good news, right? If you're going to get a raise or a promotion, the boss is going to come in, not the HR department, right? The HR department is going to likely kind of grind you down with policy or telling you something that needs to be changed, needs to be adapted to, not a conversation you really ever want to have, or a person to necessarily be around. And no offense to any of the great HR people out there, but that's the vibe that younger people are feeling about the Democratic Party right now.
I know. I was feeling slightly defensive about our HR person, who is a great contributor to the Daily Beast, I would say. Lisa Marie, if you're listening to this, I'm giving you a shout out. But it was one of the criticisms of Kamala Harris, right? right? That she appeared to be a scold, and that you're always nervous when the HR department shows up that you've inadvertently offended somebody by saying something that you hadn't thought twice about. And that, I think, is what the Democrats have been wrestling with a bit. This sense that we are all on the edge of offending someone else and being told off for it.
Exactly. And then the other piece, okay, is we heard this about both Democrats and Republicans, that if they walked into a room, they would actually be wearing one of those NASCAR type, sweaters, right? Or uniforms where you have the corporate logos, okay? Affixed to every part of your jacket or your sweater or your shirt, representing all of the people who own a piece of you, okay? And that exact metaphor was used for both the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So there's just not a lot of distance, I think, in terms of, quote, the oligarchy. Younger people are seeing both parties writ large driven by them. And what I think a lot of folks don't perhaps appreciate is younger people, and that's the reaction. You need to kind of break that image of Democrats if you're going to have a meaningful conversation about what the future looks like. This is a party, this is a group of voters, I think, who are more rational, more pragmatic, perhaps, than we might appreciate, and therefore, I think, are searching much more for anti-establishment than any necessarily ideological purity. There are going to be a number of people who voted for Donald Trump and also for Zohran Mamdani, as an example, in New York City, okay, who went Sanders, Trump, Mamdani, right? That's not about ideology. It's about, are you fighting the system or you're part of the system?